Parents, what spooky past life memory did your kid utter? When my son was 3, he told his mom that he was a cosmonaut the last time he was a grown-up. Not an _astro_not, the Russian version. We're 99% certain he hadn't heard the word before. When my daughter was 3 and starting to talk clearer, was talking to someone and concerned, I walked into the bedroom and no one was there. Initially I thought it was her playing with her toys. Days later the same scenario, but this time I asked who she was talking to and she replied, your grandma. I thought she meant my mom who had recently passed, so I showed a pic of her and asked, is this her? No, your grandma, was the reply. I found a picture of my grandma and she with a big smile said, yes, sir. I was shocked since I don't have pictures of my grandma displayed and she dies 1991 and my daughter born 2015. When my daughter was about 3 years old she would say the word specs all the time, like constantly. I'm thinking this is so bizarre, why would a child randomly start saying this? Then my wife told me that her grandfather used to work for a company called Specs. Her grandfather has been deceased quite a long time and was never even alive since my daughter was born. She used to say things to me all the time like, when I was an adult I used to do XYZ. When I was about 4 my family and I were moving house. We went to view this house in a rural village that was right by an airfield that had been very important during World War II, and there were still disused Anderson shelters in the garden and fields behind. Apparently the minute I saw them I ran to my mom, clung to her arm and asked, are there going to be more bombs? And got really agitated. Nobody ever spoke about the war. This was in the 90s, and we didn't even have a TV. My mom was really spooked by the whole thing. In 2006 my best friend Nick was Kia in Iraq. We used to wrestle, fight until one of us submitted. These sessions would start randomly and always be initiated by showing your fangs. This involved pointing your pointer and middle finger down in front of your mouth while growling at the other person. A couple of weeks after his death some family from the other side of the country that you only see every 5 years or so was visiting. My cousin's son who was about 5 and who I never met prior to this visit comes over. He gives me the fangs and smiles. I asked him, where did you learn that? He says, your friend says hi and runs away. I went to my room and cried for a bit. Not exactly the same thing, but my 5-year-old daughter has been saying things like, when I look in mirrors there are a lot of people in here, and why were so many people in my room last night? For like 2 years, my daughter, when she was 3, used to talk about her imaginary friend all the time. Said he was big and fun, and spent a lot of time playing with her. One day I was scanning old photos and had a photo of my father on my desk and she said, hey, how did you get a photo of my friend? I instantly got shivers down my spine. My father died in the house 15 years previously, and she played in a room that used to be his office. I cautiously asked her to tell me more about her friend, and without hesitating she told me he talked funny. The chills stopped me dead in my tracks because Dad was an Aussie who never lost his accent. My daughter talks about her grandson all the time. I thought it was just an imaginary friend, but then a couple nights ago she came out of her room at bedtime absolutely sobbing and said, I'm sad because I miss my grandson. He lives in my old house in my old neighborhood. She has never lived anywhere other than this apartment. Edit. Totally thought this would get buried. To answer some questions we have asked her about him, but it's pretty hit or miss on whether she'll actually answer or just think it's a fun game. The other night after some questions she told us that he sleeps in a crib and has a white tongue, but when I asked her his name a few hours ago she said Guga and laughed and laughed. It totally could be just her imagination, but she also told me some weird things about the baby I lost a few months ago, which really makes me wonder if she remembers, knows things we don't. Obligatory, not the parent but the kid here. Apparently used to have rather frequent bouts of nightmares back when I was 4. And it always began with me screaming the name Sarah, then calling for help loudly, which would wake pretty much everyone in the house up, and ending with me just blubbering out I'm so sorry over and over and over again, all the while crying and sobbing. When I would wake up in the morning, I'd have no recollection about any of this. My parents had no idea what caused it, given that they knew no one named Sarah that I had interacted with. We had no TV or anything of the sort. I hadn't begun going to preschool yet, and didn't know how to read beyond a few simple words. Nothing they did seemed able to stop it either. The whole thing went on for a good long while, almost a year, until one day, it just sort of stopped. Mom apparently tried asking me once about it, and kid me said something to the effect of, "Sarah doesn't want to see me crying anymore, so I won't." Didn't actually know any of this happened until some years back when I got to talking to my parents about how I always found the name Sarah to be beautiful. Not me but a friend's little sister. The whole family was out for dinner at a restaurant in a skiing village which they recently bought a cottage near. My friend's little sister, as soon as they walked in, said, "I know this place. My mother and I used to paint here." To which her mother replied, "We've never been here before." "What do you mean?" she replied with no. My mother from before. "We used to paint here all the time." The family was obviously a little freaked out but didn't think much of it as she was pretty young and they figured just messing around. Later on though, when talking to the waitress, the little girl again adamantly mentioned how she used to paint there, and the waitress revealed it in fact was an art studio for many years in the 1900s but had been converted sometime in the early 2000s into a restaurant. Needless to say, the entire table, waitress included, got goosebumps and were at a loss for words. I don't know how old I was, but when I was young, less than 6, I was in the car with my parents and I said something like, "Oh, I used to live there," while pointing at a house we were driving past. Turns out it was my great-great-grandmother's house. My grandma has a story from when my dad was 2 to 3 years old. He told her once that he was almost born before but was too sick and died and had to come back later. Turns out my grandma had at least one miscarriage before he was born that was likely due to birth defects caused by a medication she had been taking at the time. When he was 3, my husband decided to treat our son to a flight over our city in a Cessna. When it was time to get on the plane, our boy climbed into the pilot's seat and was extremely upset when he was told he had to move. He began crying and saying he was sorry. He didn't mean to crash the plane last time and he said he'd be good this time. My husband managed to calm him by pointing out that his legs were too short for his feet to reach the pedals. Once he got settled in the back seat, he started fussing about not being able to use the radio. So the pilot got him a headset, just didn't plug it in all the way. Our son then started trying to raise the tower so he could do his radio check and get clearance. At that point the pilot needed to take a break. He went for a smoke while my husband talked to our son, who told him that he crashed the last plane he flew and a lot of people died. When the pilot got back, they were able to do the flight with no further issues. About a year later, we went to an aeronautics museum when an old mosquito was being restored. Our son told the curator that he used to fly one of those, so he offered us a tour of the plane. When we got in, our son pointed out several things that were wrong with the plane, which turned out to be correct. Things like the joystick being the wrong sort, etc. The curator told us the plane had previously been modernized and was now being restored to original condition. He also confirmed that the items our son had pointed out were in fact slated to be replaced. Our kid is grown Mo and doesn't remember ever being a pilot before and has absolute zero interest in planes, but he does remember just knowing things about airplanes and piloting them. My daughter is deathly afraid of fire because the fire at school killed my sister and my other mom was really sad. When she started preschool at 3 they had a fire drill and she cried hysterically until it was over and she was convinced there was no fire. I had to go pick her up and on the way home she told me she's glad they have fire drills so all of the kids don't die like at her last school. I'm still freaked out. I had a brother pass away from brain cancer. At the time we had a cat who was a calico and just sort of knew he was battling something. She was really mean to most people but with him she was gentle. He would grab her paws and she would just let it happen. Well, about 3 years after he passed my parents had another child. Another boy. He was about 3 when he told my parents about the white, brown and black cat that used to let him grab her paws. She had died about a year before he was born. Mine said that he had a dream he was in heaven, or some other place before he was born, with lots of men in suits who had lined up every woman on the planet, and the suits told him to pick who would be his mom. The part that creeped me out is I remember my mom telling me I had a dream exactly like that as a child, from a message my ex sent me last year about our daughter who was 3 at the time. On hearing the motorbike I had one before I was little, it went whoosh and then I had no legs and mommy and daddy had to help me, but I didn't want to, so I went to sleep and now I'm too old. The following conversation happened between my wife and our youngest when she was 3 or 4. Daughter, I remember my old mommy. Wife, what? Daughter, like I was born, and then I was really cold. But then I woke up and you were my new mommy and laid her head on my wife. My youngest was born with complications. She was intubated and spent 2 weeks in the NICU. So there's that. I was driving my family across the state to visit family. Some commercial on the radio about Vegas came on and I started singing Viva Las Vegas in my best Elvis impersonation. My son was about 3 to 4 and he says I don't like Vegas. I lost my life and a lot of money there. His mom and I glanced at each other like WTF. He never said anything else about it.